Welcome everyone, not only here on Zoom, but also if you are watching us live on Facebook. Good afternoon. Welcome back to the 7th session of Halakhah for the Ages, reading Responsa from a Bygone era with Dr. Rachel Furst. Just a couple notes about how we run the class. If you receive an invitation from me, if you're here on Zoom to become a panelist, that would allow you to participate during class and unmute when questions and comments are invited, which I believe the class is pretty interactive, so you can pretty much jump in anytime. And feel free to also write questions and comments here on Zoom in the chat box or as a comment on Facebook, and I'll relay your messages. And please, if you're with us here on Zoom, just stay muted whenever you're not actively speaking. I will also help mute you after you are done speaking. And then just remember to press unmute when you're ready to speak again. And with that, I'll turn this to you, Rachel.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction as always. Welcome back to everyone who is rejoining today, and welcome to anyone who might be joining for the first time. These past several weeks, but the past 3 weeks in particular, we've been examining responsa that demonstrate the, or engage at least with the question of the extent to which the Halakhic authorities of medieval Ashkenaz, which is our geographic and chronological focus in this course. So we have been looking at responsa that examine the extent to which they were aware of, interested in, interacted with, and even really embraced local law. Not only local law, but also specifically local legal instruments and even local legal institutions, excuse me. And when I say local, I of course mean local non-Jewish. And if we're talking about medieval Germany, medieval Europe, we're talking primarily about Christian institutions, legal norms, etc. In that context, we've been looking particularly at the ways in which the Halakhic authorities that we've been studying, whose writings we've been engaging with, really worked with these local legal standards, norms, institutions as arbiters of halakha, or basically the way in which these Halakhic authorities kind of adopted these local norms and institutions and really took them into the Halakhic tent. In other words, engaged with them, talked about them, contended with them on a Halakhic playing field, despite the fact that we're talking about law and legal instruments and legal institutions that clearly originated outside of the Halakhic realm. Today, we're going to be continuing on that track with a different sort of example than what we've seen recently, but one that I believe nonetheless demonstrates the use of local norms to determine Jewish communal policy. Again, just for those who were with us last week, just to remind you, last week we focused on a responsum by Rabbi Chaim Or Zarua, a student of Maharam of Rothenburg, another Halakhic authority who we have had opportunity to meet. And it was a case that dealt specifically with a murder, a striking and unusual circumstance, but one that did happen in the Jewish communities of the 13th century. And in that context, we focused again specifically on the permission and even really encouragement that Rabbi Chaim ben Isaac Or Zarua gave his correspondents to turn to local law enforcement institutions, to turn to local justice institutions, if it would effectively help them in stopping the cycle or cycle of violence. Again, today, the example that we're going to look at is not one of criminal law, one that is in some senses a little bit more mundane, perhaps, but one, again, that I said I think fits into that broader question. The specific issue that we're going to be dealing with today is the question of what determined membership in a Jewish community, in medieval Ashkenaz in particular. Or another way of putting it is who counted as a member of the Jewish community. And we'll see that the answer, at least in today's responsum, comes from a somewhat surprising direction. But before we get there, I do want to spend a moment explaining the significance of this kind of question. Jewish communities in medieval Europe in general and in medieval Germany in specific, as we've discussed in previous weeks, existed by virtue of the privileges that they were granted by local authorities. In other words, the permission, the permissibility, the rights that Jewish communities had to organize as Jewish communities, and the various privileges that they were bequeathed, including, for example, the right to judge their own members, the jurisdiction that we've been discussing in previous weeks. That really was something that they were granted by local authorities. They were very dependent on local authorities for those rights and privileges. Right? So in other words, Jewish communities, existed from much further back and had their own principles of how they operated and how they organized. But again, on a technical political level, in medieval Europe, they existed by virtue of these privileges. Now, the local authorities, that means, really controlled to a certain extent, or determined to a certain extent, certainly shaped much of the nature of Jewish communal life, including the size of the Jewish communities. I think I've mentioned in weeks past that the Jewish communities of Germany, of Ashkenaz in particular, were quite small during this period. And when I say quite small, I mean that the largest of them was probably several hundred, maybe 1,000 or so people large. And some of the communities were so small that they could barely gather a minyan for holiday prayers. So we're talking about communities that were, again, varied, but for the most part, were quite small. Now, the size of these communities was determined by all sorts of factors, but among them were residence rights that during this period were more and more, as the centuries went on, really controlled and determined by local, again, non-Jewish authorities who limited the size of many of these Jewish communities. The Jewish community could only allow a certain number of residents as per the number of residence permits that they were granted by local authorities. And so the whole question of how many residence permits, who had a residence permit, who was allowed to be part of the community, became a major point of contention in these Jewish communities. So again, the question of who is a member of a Jewish community, what determines membership in a given Jewish community. On the one hand, that's a question that had a lot of significance because of these restrictions that I've been detailing. On the flip side, Jewish communities during this era were regularly taxed by the local authorities. Right? They were granted these privileges in exchange for various responsibilities, including significant taxes that they paid to local authorities, to the royal authorities. And these taxes that were imposed on the Jewish community was actually a reason for many of these Jewish communities to want to include as many individuals as they could within their ranks, right? So whereas on the one hand, we had this restrictive tendency because of the limited number of residence permits that they were granted. On the other hand, because I'm sorry, I should have said it just a moment ago, that the way they were taxed during this era, and we're going to be seeing it in today's Responsa, the way that they were taxed during this era was primarily in a lump sum. In other words, whether it was the royal authority, whether it were local authorities who were taxing them directly or who were taxing them as agents of the king, they would generally impose a lump sum, a particular amount of money on the Jewish community that they were responsible to raise within a given amount of time. How precisely they raised the money and how they divided it up among their members was usually left to the community itself. And that's going to be the issue that we see being really fought out today. And from that perspective, these Jewish communities were, for the most part, interested in including as many people as they could within their ranks, because the more taxable members of the community who were counted, the lower the amounts of taxes that the individual would have to pay, right? And so those are some of the tensions that we're going to see at play as we get into today's Responsum, which again deals with this question of who's a member of the community, but again, as I said, from a sort of unusual perspective, or perhaps surprising perspective, which is this question of who's considered a taxable member of the community. We're going to turn to the Responsum itself in just a moment, but before we do, I want to add one more word of introduction, and that is, as we're now moving, as Evie said a few minutes ago, we're now in the 7th week of this course. We're moving towards the final weeks of this particular course. And one of the questions that I'd like us to consider more and more explicitly as we move towards the final weeks of the course is a question that's really contained within or implied in the title of this class. I called it Halakhah for the ages, and I really intended for there to be a question mark at the end of that phrase. I'd like us to think about the extent to which the responsa that we've been studying participate in or contribute to a sort of eternal and ongoing halachic discourse, versus the extent to which they reflect the evolving and contingent nature of halakha. To make that a little bit more explicit, do the sources that we have been studying, these responsa from medieval Ashkenaz, do they have halachic value beyond the window that they provide us into a specific moment in the evolution of halakha? Do they have value for the ages? And again, I'm just going to put it out there for now, but I think today is a good opportunity to really begin discussing that issue. Okay, I'd like to share my screen with you. We're going to, again, all of you should have the text, but before I put up the text that we're going to be studying today, I do want to take just a moment to, as usual, locate us geographically, chronologically, etc. The responsum that we're going to be examining today is actually very difficult to locate precisely. Right? We've seen responsa that we located in Magdeburg. That was last week. We saw responsa that we located in the Rhine region. We saw a responsum that we located in the Würzburg area. So different parts of the medieval German Empire. Today's responsum, we know, originated somewhere in the medieval German Empire. That's going to be very clear. But where precisely is, at least to the best of my knowledge, very difficult to determine. And that's because the responsum, unlike some of the others we've seen, doesn't really provide us with any geographical clues, nor does it really provide us with personalities who we might be able to place a little bit better. We're going to be, we'll see that the responsum we're looking at today is a responsum, once again, by Rabbi Chaim ben Isaac or Zerah, who, as we've said in the past, he was one of the more prominent students of Rabbi Meir ben Baruch of Rothenburg, Maharami Rothenburg, and he really rose to prominence as a halachic authority after first the imprisonment in 1286 and subsequently the death of Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg in 1293. He and some of the other students who we've encountered, like the Rosh, Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel, and a number of others, really sort of stepped in when Rabbi Meir ben Baruch of Rothenburg was no longer really functioning as a halachic authority towards the end of the 13th century. We don't know exactly when Chaim died, which makes it hard to even give an end date, a possible end date for when precisely this responsa may have been written. Scholars believe he died probably sometime in the middle of the second decade of the 14th century, so sometime around 1315, but we don't know more than that. So that's as far as location and chronology for today are concerned.
Rachel, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yes,
I think, Debbie, do you still have a question or a comment?
I'm sorry, I did not see that. If you do,
No,
anyone
it's
who has a
okay. I
question
just
is welcome
noticed that
to
Debbie
jump
had
in.
her hand up. That's all.
Please.
Yes. You said that the Jews wanted to up their population in order to decrease each individual's tax burden, right? If I'm paraphrasing what you had said earlier, is that correct?
Yes. In other words, again, I was trying to point out that there were these tensions within the Jewish communities as to the number of people who might be counted as members of the community. But yes, from the perspective of the taxes, it was to the advantage of the community to count as many people as possible, or as many tax-paying members as possible, because that would lower the burden on the
individual,
right?
Right.
On each individual,
Now,
exactly.
were the people who levied the taxes, would they be aware of how many Jews were living there?
Okay, so that is such an excellent question that we're going to see it becomes one of the real sticking points in the halachic discussion that we're about to take a look at. So
Okay.
I'm going to defer your question, but I promise you that we will get back to that. And again, as I said, that's really going to be one of the central issues that comes up in the halachic discussion, right? For now, just as a piece of background, what's important to appreciate is that the way the taxes were levied on local Jewish communities was usually, certainly in the context that we're discussing today, in a lump sum, right? And then again, they would just leave it to the local Jewish community to figure out how to come up with the money, right? And so many of the halachic discussions that we have about tax-related discussions that we have in halachic literature, in the Responsa literature in particular, deal with this question of how to divide up this tax burden, which again was a standard common occurrence, right? It was a yearly annual occurrence, but it often happened even more than that because taxes were often imposed at the whim of the local ruler or in order to raise money for a particular military campaign or in order to raise money for a particular celebration or anniversary, or because the local ruler was suddenly being pressured by royal authorities to fork over some more money, or the local ruler had debts himself that he needed to get rid of. So there were all kinds of reasons why taxes were frequently, again, regular taxes and these non-standard taxes were imposed on local Jewish communities. And for the most part, how they came up with the money was their own problem. They were left to their own devices. And that's where we really see Halakhah stepping in as a kind of guidance, as a form of guidance to the local communities. In other words, the local communities looked to the Halakhah to try and figure out this question of how are we going to divide this burden fairly among us?
Were these
Debbie, it looks like you have
taxes
another question.
were these taxes just levied on the Jewish communities or on all the communities?
Okay, so taxes were levied on all local, meaning all local communities, all local individual, all individuals within the realms had to pay annual taxes and oftentimes had to pay these, special irregular taxes. But the Jewish community usually paid independently of the rest of the local population, right? So the methods whereby the different segments, different other segments of the local population collected the taxes is, a separate question that the Jewish community usually was usually treated as a distinctive tax source by these authorities. So they were paying independent of the locals, of other locals, other local groups, although other local groups were certainly taxed as well. I would even just add to that, for example, sometimes the clergy were taxed as a distinctive group. And various other sub-communities were oftentimes taxed distinctively. The Jews constituted a distinctive tax group for sure.
Thank you.
Okay. Please continue to ask if you have more questions. Just to explain to you what is what you're looking at in front of you on the screen. This is the same manuscript that we saw last week. I wanted once again just to give you a sense of sort of the textual, the material evidence that we have for these halachic discussions. And as I mentioned last week, when it comes to the Responsa of Rabbi Chaim ben Isaac or Zarua, we actually only have one medieval copy of his Responsa collection, and this is it. You're looking at this is the page that contains, or that where the Responsa that we're going to be examining today begins. As I mentioned last week, it's a particularly this manuscript is particularly striking for its sort of clean and easy read. And again, as I pointed out last week, oftentimes the margins of these texts are filled with all kinds of corrections and notes and later copyists' additions. Manuscripts were expensive. The parchment was very expensive. And so copyists would use every inch available. I don't have a very clear answer as to why in this case the margins were left so clean, except for the fact that this manuscript seems to have dropped out of circulation for several hundred years until it resurfaced again in the 19th century, as we discussed last week. In any event, and as I mentioned last week, and as you can see down here on the bottom, the manuscript is currently held by the University of Frankfurt Library. We're going to take a look at the text that I sent out to everyone, the PDF text. But I do want to just take a look together at this opening paragraph that I copied for you here, because just to sort of ease in not having to switch back and forth the screens too much, there's one other text that I'd like to show you that is perhaps relevant to our discussion. So this is the way the responsum, whoops, excuse me, I apologize about that. This is the way the responsum begins. What you have asked regarding the community council that submitted claims against Reuben, claiming that they issued an ordinance that anyone who comes to reside with us in the city in the middle of the year must pay tax retroactively in accordance with what they gave at the beginning of the year. This is the way the responsum begins. Again, we'll see that in our other text in just a moment. Now we're going to talk in a moment about who the questioner was. This seems to be Chaim or Zarua's restatement of the question that was submitted to him. But we can already understand from this opening passage that the dispute he was asked to adjudicate is one between a local community. Again, where precisely this community was located, we don't know, but a dispute between a local community or the representatives of that local community, in other words, the community council, referred to in the original as the Kehal. It was a dispute between this Kehal and an individual named Reuben. This individual, Reuben, as we're about to see, came from the outside, right? He originated outside the community. He must have, as we're going to hear precisely where he lived, but he was not originally a member of the community. Nonetheless, the community claims that Reuben owes them a tax contribution. Why does Reuben owe them a tax contribution? Because this community issued an ordinance, a takana in halachic terms, that anyone who joined their community by virtue of their residence, anyone who came to reside with this community in a city, right? So we're talking about, that's also, we're going to see that becomes important. We're talking about an urban-based Jewish community. Anyone who joined them, anyone who switched their residence to this Jewish community, urban Jewish community in the middle of the year, had to pay taxes with them retroactively in accordance with what they gave at the beginning of that year. In other words, the Jewish community had already given their taxes at the beginning of the year, the lump sum, right? This person who joined thereafter in the middle of the year had to retroactively, was required by local community ordinance, by local community standards and norms, to pay taxes retroactively with the community. And again, we've discussed why they would want to grandfather this person into their community. And behold, says Chaim, you, Reuben, came to reside in a village within the Shabbat limit, specifically the Tchum. This is a halachic concept that some of you may be familiar with, the idea of a Tchum Shabbat. A Tchum Shabbat is usually discussed in the context of how far one is allowed to travel outside the seat of the town or the city on Shabbat. Right? This doesn't even have to do necessarily with carrying, but there are restrictions on how far one is allowed to, and when I say travel, I mean walk, right? So in other words, how far is one allowed to walk on Shabbat outside of the residential area? And there is, the halakhah is that the Tchum Shabbat, this restricted, or the extent of this permitted area, is about 2,000 outside of the, of the end. You could, again, we're imagining a residential area, a built-up area that has a clear endpoint, right? Some, today many urban areas kind of bleed into one another. I happen to live in a town where there is a clear endpoint. The houses stop, and then there's just, undeveloped land. How far are you allowed to walk outside of this settled area on Shabbat? That's what we mean when we talk about the Tchum Shabbat. But in this context, in the context of our responsum, their use of the Tchum is not, it's not a question about how far anybody can walk on Shabbat. It's a question about what else, of what additional halachic significance is that perimeter, is that Tchum, is that area. You know what, I'm just going to use this opportunity to ask if everybody who's not speaking could please just mute themselves. That would be helpful, thank you. Okay, so they argue with him that this local community argues that Reuben moved or came to reside in a village that was within the Shabbat limit, within the Tchum Shabbat, meaning within these 2,000 amma of the town, of the city in question. And every day you conduct business in the city like one of us, right? So he lived in a village that was outside of the city, but within the Tchum Shabbat. And he came into the city every day for business purposes. And therefore, say, the members of this community or the community council, we demand of you retroactive taxes in accordance with their or our ordinance, our takana. Okay, now I just want to point out before we switch to our PDF file that this use of the halachic concept of Tchum Shabbat is not unique to our responsum. It is in fact fairly common within medieval Ashkenazi responsa that the Tchum Shabbat is used, this concept of a Shabbat perimeter is used as a means of determining who is in and who is out, who is considered a resident and who is not considered a resident of a particular community, right? So what you see in front of you right now, we'll just take a brief look at it, is a different responsa, not the one we're going to be dealing with today, written by Meir of Rotenberg, the teacher of Chaim Or Zara, who's our respondent for today. And in this particular responsa, Meir of Rotenberg argues, right, that a particular person belongs to a given community, right? A particular person named Simeon. I'm sorry. In this particular response, Meir rules that the protagonist or the defendant Simeon is not considered a member of a particular community because he resides far from the city more than the distance of the Shabbat perimeter, and also under the authority of a different ruler, right? So the point that we see, and he states this again later on, it seems that even if he settles within the Shabbat perimeter but outside the city outskirts, he's not included in the city. So this question of whether the Tchum Shabbat has any halachic significance for determining who belongs to the community or who doesn't belong to the community, we're going to see that becomes a relevant thing. Okay, I'm going to stop this particular screen share right now. And now I'd like to share with you the text itself, and we'll try to parse this a little bit more clearly. Bear with me for one moment as I get the text up. 1 second. Okay, here we go. Sorry, please bear with me for a second. Okay. So again, that's what we just read. That's really the opening passage of today's responsa. Now, before we continue, I want to show you, and you can, I'm scrolling down on my screen, and you can take a look on your copy of the text as well. You can see at the top of page 2 that the questioner, the one whom Chaim Or Zara is addressing in his response, is a scholar by the name of Mordechai Berabi Avraham, Mordechai son of Avraham Sheikhya, may he live. So we do actually have the name of a questioner here, but it doesn't help us too much in terms of locating or dating this piece because unfortunately we don't know who this scholar is. We don't have any other texts attributed to him or texts addressed to him. And it doesn't really help us in any way in terms of again, location or dating. Okay, but let's go back to what Chaim said. So we heard the argument, the opening argument of this unnamed Jewish community is that Reuben resides in a village that is within the Tchum Shabbat of their city. That's A. And B, Reuben comes into the city every day to conduct business just like all the other members of the community. And therefore, again, they're demanding that he participate with them retroactively in the taxes that had been levied on them since the beginning of the year. What's Reuben's response? What's Reuben's counter argument? I hope that you can see where I am. And Reuben responds, I sit under a different ruler, and I pay a substantial tax to him. And with this, they, that is you, right, members of this community, did not assist me even 1 penny, and I do not have any business with them. And furthermore, I am beyond the outskirts of the city. And I did not conduct business in a city worth more than 10 pounds at most, had I not settled accounts with my debtors who owed me money previously and called for me when they came to the city. Right? So any additional money that you see, that's just old debts, right? Really, this year, I did not conduct any business that was worth more than 10 pounds, which is a fairly modest amount. And you never warned me not to conduct business in your city. Okay, so let's pause here for just a moment. What are his arguments? Why is he not part of this community as far as he's concerned? What are the things that he has listed here?
He lives outside. He pays to somebody.
Okay, so first of all, I don't live in the city. I live outside the city. Now, the significance of living outside in the city, that he takes note of the fact that he
has allegiance to somebody else.
Well, I don't know if it's allegiance, but it's.
I pay taxes to somebody
Pay
else.
taxes, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that he has allegiance to a different ruler, but that he has been claimed by a different community, a different authority, right? He has already paid taxes to a different ruler. Now, I want you to just imagine this for 1 second. We have a big city, or a big-ish city, where there's one Jewish community, right? And that city is apparently paying taxes to one local ruler. And we have a small village outside of the city. Now, sometimes the small villages outside of these cities were kind of satellites of the big city and would pay taxes, in fact, to this, with the big city, to the same local ruler as the big city. But in this particular case, the small village in which Reuben resided was actually owned by, or claimed by, a different local authority. And here also, I just want you to take note of the fact that in medieval Germany in particular, it was very fragmented. In other words, these lands were divided up to no end between local rulers. They oftentimes passed back and forth between local rulers. So it wasn't so unusual that even a village that was within fairly close geographic proximity to the bigger city might, again, be owned or pay taxes to a different local authority, right? That's not too unusual. So that's what Reuben claims. He says, listen, I'm a tax-paying member of a different group. I don't owe you anything. And he also responds, so that's one reason that he argues. What's his other argument for why he does not belong to this community, why he's not a member of this community?
He lives outside the Tchum.
Well, he says
outskirts.
He's not really arguing about whether he is or is not within the Tchum. There, again, he lives where his village is located, where it's located. The members of the Jewish community in the city are claiming him because they say you're within the Shabbat Tchum, and the Shabbat Tchum determines, right? Therefore, you belong to us. And he says that may be, but my village is a different political entity, because I pay taxes to a different local ruler. So that's what we said. That's the first argument that he makes. The second argument that he makes is to counter their claim that he was doing business in the city and should therefore be counted with the Jewish community in the city, right? What does he say about that?
I only come in to pay off a debt that I had.
I did conduct a little bit of business, but it was really insignificant. It wasn't more than 10 pounds. Anything else that you saw me doing in the city was an old debt. That doesn't count for anything anyway. And furthermore, you never warned me, right? You never told me that if I started conducting business in your city, you were going to claim my taxes, right? And he adds to that, I didn't read this beforehand, but he adds to that, and I recall, right, says Reuben, that there were already cases of Jews who resided in the villages all around me under the other government, under this other local lord like me, and they conducted in the business in the city just like you did, and they did not contribute anything to the tax. And they were there far longer than now, meaning far longer than I have been. Give me to this rule like them, right? You didn't tax those other guys, don't tax me either. To which the community, I'm not the first one in this situation. There's already a precedent for this. You shouldn't make a new rule for me. You should deal with me the same way you've dealt with others in this situation in the past. To which the community responds, the earlier ones, right, meaning our predecessors who made that arrangement with those individuals that you're talking about now, forgave them intentionally, right? They had their own deal with those guys that you're talking about. But it is not our intention to forgive you. Why? Right? Now, forgive you, when they say forgive you, they mean forgive your taxes, let you off the hook as far as the taxes are concerned. Why? Because every day you go with the members of your household to the synagogue in our city to conduct your business, and we attract attention. This is where Debbie, I want to ask you to point out to you that your question is being discussed, right? And we say, again, says the community council, we as a community attract attention. And the Hebrew, the Halakhic term is yesh lanu ayin. Ayin literally means an eye, right? we have an eye, or we have an eye on us, is the way I would translate it, because of you. In other words, we as a community are attracting attention, and we're going to see in a moment that they mean the attention of the local authorities because of you. Why? For you make purchases in the city, both small and large. Okay, so in other words, we're being watched by the locals because of you. Now, what would be the significance of that? What might be the significance of the fact that Reuben is causing this community to draw the attention to draw the attention of the local authorities?
Then they're aware of the populace.
Okay, and what would be, why does that matter?
They then can figure out how much business is going on, and they can estimate how much taxes.
Okay, so presumably the argument on the part of the community council is we are being taxed more by the local authorities because they
of the
think that you and your business are part of us, right? So in other words, that this seems to be based on an assumption that the local authorities are actually imposing whatever lump sum they impose on the Jewish community in accordance with how many individuals they think belong to that community, or how much business they think the community is generating. Now, the accuracy of this is a matter of is really a matter of debate, but that is the halachic argument here. That seems to be the assumption of these community council members. And that is not an uncommon assumption. That comes up over and over again in these halachic texts that discuss related issues. In other words, the halachic authorities certainly assumed and understood that they were being taxed in accordance with some kind of assessment on the part of the local Christian authorities as to the size or as to the business revenue of their community. And that's why it matters to them whether Reuben, additionally to everything else, that's why they are claiming that Reuben really owes them the taxes, his taxes. Now, Reuben responds to all this. Regarding my renting of a house in the city, I regretted that and stayed under my ruler as originally. And regarding this leadership, I'm sorry, I skipped a line. I apologize. I skipped a few lines here. Right, so they said, you make yesh lanu ayin, because of you, for you make purchases in the city, both large and small. And the community council claimed further against Reuben, during the year of the ordinance, meaning during this past year, the year for which the takana is relevant, you rented a house with us in the city, and you wanted to come and settle here immediately after the year of the ordinance passed. And we even appointed you to be a leader with us when you would have come to the city. And in the course of this, the outside authorities, requested another tax, and this too we demand of you. To which Reuben responded, regarding my renting of a house in the city, I regretted that and stayed under my ruler as originally, right? So it's true that I originally rented a house in the city and thought that I would move my residence to the Jewish community of this city, but I changed my mind and I stayed in the village. And regarding this leadership, you made a condition with me that if I did not come to reside with you by the first day of the month, once the year of the ordinance had passed, then that condition would be voided. And that's what happened, that I did not come to you. In other words, it's true that you appointed me to be a community leader, to be a parnas, but it was conditional and I never met the condition. So that's an irrelevant argument, according to Reuben. And I have no business with you, nor do you attract any attention because of me. For all the non-Jews know that I reside in the village of a different ruler that does not belong to the kingdom, and you give taxes to the king. Right, and so now we hear another detail. Apparently the city, the Jewish community of the city in question, actually paid taxes directly to the royal authorities, directly to the king. And we know this again from local, from medieval German history. We know that there were some cities and some villages that paid their taxes directly to the king. They were claimed directly by royal authorities, whereas there were other villages and towns that paid to local rulers, whether the local rulers, again, had the right to tax them or whether the local rulers were collecting on behalf of the king. It's kind of complicated. There were many different kinds of arrangements, but in any event, it seems like the Jewish community in this city was paying directly to the king, whereas the Jewish community of the village in which Reuben resided was paying to a local lord. And he says, I am not, again, I am not going to pay with you for all the reasons I enumerated. And in addition to everything else, your claim of, again, what we said was ayin, your claim that I caused you to attract more attention, and therefore I caused the lump sum of taxes imposed upon your community to become higher, is simply not true, because all non-Jews that know that I reside elsewhere, in other words, the non-Jews would not have considered me a member of your community, which kind of implies a fair amount of trust in, well, it attributes a lot of
notoriety
awareness to the local
and
authorities, but also a fair
notoriety.
amount of trust that they were doing a reasonable and fair job of assessing who belonged where and how much taxes they should therefore impose.
And that
In any event, yes, please, sorry.
Oh, sorry, Debbie, can you unmute again? I apologize.
that he was known, that he had notoriety, that he was a personality, this Reuven.
Also, right? That also, that's what he at least is implying here, right? And again, this question was submitted by Mordechai, son of Rabbi Abraham, who says to Chaim or Zerua, you, my teacher, enlighten us and enlighten our rule, for we have cast our hopes with you, and peace, sincerely, etc., etc. Okay, that's the question. Now let's take a look at Chaim's response. What does Chaim, does Chaim accept Reuben's arguments? Does Chaim accept the community's arguments? Does Chaim provide us with additional methods for determining who is considered a community member under such circumstances? Let's take a look. So he writes as follows. I am not worthy of your having sent this query to me. Someone asked last week whether these kinds of, expressions of humility are typical of medieval respondents. And I said, yes, here we have one again. And it seems to me that in truth, the law regarding Reuben is that he is completely exempt, for he resides under a different ruler, right? So we can see at the outset, who does Chaim favor in this dispute? Reuben, right? Clearly, he accepts Reuben's arguments at the expense of those of the community council. And his brief summary of why is because he says, Reuben is correct. He resides in this village, which is owned by a different ruler or claimed by a different ruler. And therefore he pays taxes to that ruler, and he does not have to pay tax with the Jewish community in the city. Here's the part that I want to highlight. And this is what we observe regarding non-Jews who reside in settlements. Presumably, they too come to the city on a daily basis and purchase all their necessities and conduct business in the city just like him, i.e. Reuben. Although the king levied taxes on the people of the city, the people of the town do not participate with them. And certainly not the Jews, so that they do not capitulate to the evil ones. Okay, so let's pause here for one moment. What is Chaim's argument? Why should Reuben not be considered a member of this community? Again, first and foremost, it's because he resides in a village that pays taxes to a different local
rule.
authority. But why is that? Why is that the determining factor as far as Chaim is concerned?
Because non-Jews who reside in settlements and they also come in and do work, they also don't.
Because those are the local norms, right? That's the way the non-Jews, right? And this, again, I think goes back to your question, Debbie, about whether taxes were imposed in these kinds of ways on other groups who were not Jewish. Yes, they also, got caught up in these kinds of fights as to who was a member of which tax group, who paid taxes to whom. And the way that they locally determined it is that anybody who resided in the city belonged to the city and paid taxes to the city's authority. And anybody who resided in these villages outside the city, who were, again, under the jurisdiction of a different lord, would pay taxes to that different lord, even if they conducted business in the city, right? So why in the world, says Chaim, should Reuben not be treated accordingly, right? We know what the local norms are, right? And by the way, I just want to point out in parentheses, Chaim obviously did his homework. We don't know that Chaim was probably not living here himself. right? This Mordechai ben Rabbi Avraham was the local authority. He didn't know what to do, and he, turned to Chaim for some guidance. But Chaim obviously either did his homework or was familiar with the setup in this particular town. And he says to them, listen, these are the local norms. Treat Reuben like any local, right? He should be treated the same way that the non-Jews would. And we know the way the non-Jews determine these things, right? So going back to this theme that we've been exploring for the past several weeks, here again, we see that a halachic authority is pointing to local norms, is allowing the local norms, is really using the local norms to dictate what the halachic response should be. He goes on to say, although the king levied taxes on the people of the city, the people of the town do not participate with them, certainly not the Jews, so that they do not capitulate to the evil ones. And the king's intention is only to collect taxes from the people of the city, right? So the king doesn't even want the taxes of the people of these villages, right? Probably because the king himself was the one who gave the local lords the rights and privileges to collect from the villages, right? So the king is not looking at the moment to collect from the villages. He's only looking to collect from the town. And if they wish, they may say to the king, right? So claims Chaim, right? If the members of the city, of the urban Jewish community want to, they can say to the king, so-and-so who resides in the village does not pay with us. Now, this sounds a little bit sketchy to me. I have to be honest. I'm not sure that a local Jewish community could simply write away to the king and say, listen, by the way, this guy Reuben, right? He really pays with the village, so don't bother with him. I'm not sure that was exactly the way things worked, but that's what Chaim claims here. And I think that's, the fact that he makes that part of his halachic claim is perhaps significant. As a matter of fact, he doesn't only make it part of his halachic claim, he claims that was the precedent. That's the way that our teacher, Rabbi Meir ben Baruch of Rotenberg, may his memory be a blessing, is responded to similar such situations, that we are not obligated to save him with our money. I don't want to get into the halachic complications, the halachic particulars there. But they should not say to the king that he conducts unspecified business in the city, rather that his business is only worth 10 pounds. Thus, they do not attract any attention, en lahem shum ayin, on account of him, right? And again, back to this business of how the local authorities determine how much taxes is, how much attention do individuals or the communities attract from the local authorities. That's these nitty gritties are what Chaim is trying to hash out here. Right, and he adds, Chaim addresses this question of the previous accounts with debtors that this man had, what he does there to settle accounts with debtors to whom he lent previously. For this, it does not seem appropriate to obligate him at all. And even if the people of the settlement would want to protest this matter, it would seem that they cannot, for it's no worse than this case in the Talmudic tractate, and he gets into another thing where he says, basically, there's no, right, don't bother arguing with me, don't bother appealing with me, there's no two ways about this. And I want to just jump down to the end of this paragraph, right? And it seems, in my humble opinion, that he is not obligated to pay with them, meaning with the members of the urban Jewish community, and they can say, again, to the king who collects their taxes, so-and-so who resides in the village does not pay. Right? And regarding his rental of the house and his appointment as Parnas, that whole sub-argument that he was having with the community as to whether he did intend to move to the city, as to whether they did appoint him a leader, whether that has any relevance to this question of where he pays taxes, says Chaim, it seems to me that his response is truthful and there is no need to clarify further. This is the opinion of Chaim, son of the master of the Isaac, may he rest in Eden, right? So Chaim is pretty clear about his ruling, comes down very distinctively on the side of Reuben here. Now, that was the end, presumably, of the response that Chaim sent to this, this local authority, this Mordechai ben Rabbi Avraham, who was apparently the initial person to try and adjudicate this dispute between the local community and this Reuben. But interestingly, what we have I spoke a little bit about in previous weeks about the nature of these responsa collections. In this particular case, it seems like when Chaim or his students or whoever was collecting the responsa and trying to shape this collection, when he after he had copied or after he had collated this particular responsum, he decided to add an additional halachic note. Again, it's not, let's assume that it's Chaim who penned this additional note. Again, whether Chaim was the one who collected all of these responsa and organized them in the way that they appear is very unclear. But we know that Chaim did some work in terms of starting to gather his materials. And it seems that he appended the following notes, right? This is kind of a summary of his halachic position. We do not obligate any person on account of attention that he may attract, right? Mitam ayin is the Hebrew, right? Again, this is your question, Debbie, right? We don't obligate an individual on the basis of an assumed amount of attention that he might draw to the Jewish community. As Rabbeinu Tam, right, the famous Rabbeinu Tam, the famous, very significant authority, medieval France, but Ashkenazi as far as the halachic tradition is concerned, as Rabbeinu Tam responded, for even from the lender's portion, one does not pay according to the law, except that the people of the city can say to the king, so-and-so has in his hand property that belongs to others, right? So this is another related case, but in other words, we don't rule on the basis of presumed attention because we assume that the local Jewish community can always reason with the king and say, listen, this guy is not part of us, right? Which is, again, this is a very striking statement about the kinds of trust, I think, that these halachic authorities seem to have in the local, in the rationality and in the reasonableness of local authorities in their determinations of who did or did not belong to individual communities for taxation purposes. Right, and he says, so it seems from the language of Rabbi Elazar ben Yoel Halevi, the famous Ra'avya, who wrote in the name of Rabbeinu Tam. So he says, this is Rabbeinu Tam's ruling. This is the Ra'avya's tradition. He's kind of calling upon all the heavyweights of medieval Ashkenaz to argue for his halachic position. Let's jump down just a moment. He says, furthermore, do you see where I am? Kind of in the middle of a line about 5 lines down. And furthermore, if we want to go in accordance with the attention, right? So Rabbeinu Tam and Ravya say we don't rule in accordance with this concept of ayin or attention. But even if we do want to go in accordance with the attention, even if we want to go achar ayin, meaning we want to claim that the amount of attention that an individual causes to be drawn to the Jewish community is relevant for determining who does or doesn't pay taxes. If so, from the pledges we will not give, right? And what our teacher, the master Rabbi Mordechai, wrote, that in Speyer and Regensburg, they rule that one is obligated to pay taxes from what one lent in their city after receiving a warning. I do not know the reason for this, right? He's referring to as precedent what the rule was, what apparently the halachic standard was in Speyer and Regensburg, meaning in these other significant Jewish communities of the era. But he says, I don't even know what they're talking about. I don't understand their ruling. For if it is so, we do not find Rabbeinu Tam, may the memory of the righteous be a blessing, interpreted. In other words, their position seems to contradict Rabbeinu Tam. I'm going to rule with Rabbeinu Tam. For all of these reasons, again, I'm jumping down about 2 or 3 lines. It seems to me that on account of the attention, mishum ayin, we do not obligate him as long as the kahal can say to the king, so-and-so does business in our city, but he does not pay taxes with us. Okay? Again, that's his bottom line. And he adds, and this is just a sort of kind of interesting side note to perhaps conclude with, he says, this is all about taxes that the Jewish community owed to local rulers. In contrast, but charity and guests and other burdens of the city, he, meaning Reuben or anybody in Reuben's position, is obligated to pay with them on the basis of what he lent in the city. For in these things, what they say to the king is not corrective. In other words, so he makes a distinction here between the taxes that are being paid to outside authorities and the kinds of, I don't want to call them exactly taxes, but the kinds of collections that the Jewish community would have made internally for the purposes of taking care of their own members, right? And this seems to suggest that the Jewish communities of the time, although here too there's a matter of a bit of dispute among historians, but it seems like the Jewish communities were doing some kind of regular charity collections for the sake of local poor, of the Jewish community, for the sake of guests, right, who were often itinerant poor that showed up in their city, right? They would set up some kind of, collection for them, ways of taking responsibility for them that community members would pitch in for. Those kinds of collections for the sake of the Jewish community itself, an individual like Reuben, who did conduct some amount of business with this in this local city, would have to pay with the local Jewish community. So that's just as a sidebar, as a caveat that we're not going to have time to explain or get into too much today. Again, these are the concluding notes that Chaim makes to add to the response that he sent off originally. We're gonna pull it together for now because our time is up. Again, the point that I wanted you to pay particular attention to is, first of all, this question of who does or who does not belong to the community, but in particular, the way that Chaim, as we have seen Chaim himself and other respondents do in previous weeks, in the context of previous responsa, really seems to draw upon the local norms, the local standards, the local approach, meaning the non-Jewish standards and approach, as a determinant of what the Jewish community should be doing, as a determinant of the way the Jewish community should be conducting its own affairs. And he deals with that, he treats that as a source of halachic guidance. In other words, he's responding to them as a halachic authority, but as a halachic authority, he's not only looking to standard classic halachic sources like the Talmud or other rulings, which he also does, as we've just seen. But in addition to all of those classic halachic sources, he also is very reliant, without any apologetics, on local legal norms. And with that, I will conclude for today. I'm happy to take any additional questions you might have, or to ask you, as always, to please, as they might occur to you, jot them down, and we can deal with them in future weeks. Yes, Debbie, I see that you have another.
I didn't mean to monopolize here today, but
no, please. You've had a lot of great comments that are helpful for I think all of
it. From these statements seem to remind me that even today in our tax system, if you live in, let's say, New Jersey, but you work in New York, you're taxed by New Jersey. You're not taxed or minimally taxed by New York, that it goes according to the place of residence. It doesn't go according to where you work so much.
Yeah,
and that seems to me just like this.
Yeah. No, so I appreciate that you're pointing. I mean, again, the methods for determining how taxes today work, are obviously different than they would have been in, medieval, in this sort of complicated feudal system of medieval Europe or medieval Germany in particular. But definitely the kinds of questions that they're contending with are not ones that are entirely foreign to current tax realities, or for that matter, to current Jewish communal realities, although that we can perhaps discuss further next week. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you everyone else who joined us here on Zoom and also on Facebook. We will see each other again next week. Just a few announcements. This Thursday evening, Rabbi Silber will give a special Purim shiur for such a time as this, Reflections on Purim after October 7th. It will be at 8:30 p.m. Eastern. And then we also have Drisha's 25th annual Rappaport Memorial Lecture this coming Sunday, says this coming Sunday, but not this coming Sunday. We have it on April 7th at 12 p.m. Rabbi Silber will be teaching on the topic of the Seder ritual and the formation of community. So that's again on April 7th. Sorry for the error. You can sign up for that at rappaport.drisha.org. And again, you can always find classes and sign up for classes at 5784.drisha.org. And I hope to see you soon. Again, thank you so much. Lehitraot.
Happy Purim.
Happy Purim.
Yeah.